Good day. Welcome to Ruby's live event. Today is all things flour, proofing, and baking. We're going to be with chefs Jacquy Pfeiffer and Martin Phillip from the King Arthur Company, and we're going to dive into the details of all the different flours. So this is coming from our courses that we've developed with the French Pastry School and Chef Jacquy and Sebastian. We have the pastry arts, about 60 hours. We have bread baking arts, about 70 hours. And then we have the cake decorating and baking course, approximately 70 hours. So 3 online courses that are supported by Chef Jacquy and team in terms of the grading. But today we are going to dive in with a guest chef from King Arthur Company, Martin Phillip. But first, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Chef Jacquy Pfeiffer of the French Pastry School in Chicago. And then he can introduce our guest, Martin Phillip. So Chef Jacquy.
Hello, nice to see you again. We actually spent the weekend together at the National Restaurant Association show in Chicago, which was a lot of fun. It was good to see the industry come back in full force. And just wanted to say a few words. I've been running the French Pastry School for the last 26 years, and a couple of years ago we decided to make our courses available online through Ruby, our wonderful friends of Ruby, and we just love the interaction we have with the students and the fact that we can actually offer these courses, intensive courses, for anybody who desires to learn more and doesn't necessarily have to leave their job or move to another country or another city. And so I'm very pleased with our students and the output they show us every day. And with that said, I want to introduce Chef Martin Phillip, who is the master baker at King Arthur Baking. He's going to be here today to help us understand more the different types of flours and how to use them, and what recommendation he has for all of them. Chef Martin, you want to say a few words about yourself and King Arthur Baking?
Thank you, Jacquy. Greetings, everyone. My name is Martin Phillip. I've worked at King Arthur Baking Company since 2006. I spent a lot of years in production baking, and now I tend to talk to people who are using home tools more than professional tools, although I've done consulting in the professional realm as well. I started as a home baker. I guess I started as a home eater at the hip of my mother and father, making bread every week, 10 to 15 loaves. So baking is kind of in my blood. I see it as a way for people to connect. I see it as a way to share. I see it as a way to build community, both among bakers, but also more broadly in society. I think baking is a powerful tool for lots of things. King Arthur was founded in 1790 and initially imported flour from overseas. And then over time, we developed relationships with growers in the States and millers. And we've continued today transitioning to an employee-owned company in the 1990s. We're also a benefit corporation, which means that we evaluate ourselves in terms of how we treat our employees, how we treat the environment, and how we interact with our community. So we're a values-based organization, which places high value on quality of product and also quality content and reaching broad audiences wherever they exist of passionate bakers. I guess as a baker, I've competed around the world and also have been able to spend my time volunteering internationally as well in underserved communities, bringing bread and the power of baking to places where it might not traditionally be seen. And I also wrote a book in 2017 called Breaking Bread, Baker's Journey Home in 75 Recipes. And I think that's enough to know about me, other than the fact that I'm a passionate baker. And I'm excited and honored to be here today with Jacquy and also with Ruby and Scott. And thanks to Patrick in the background here, keeping us on time and connected. So cheers, and thanks for having me.
Great. Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Chef Jacquy. So today the concept is different flours, and our students have been inquiring about the different flours on the market, how to use them, from all-purpose flour, pastry flour, bread flour, whole wheat flour. And let's just get a little bit about the background, because we're going to be talking about wheat-based flours. There's all sorts of flours on the market, but wheat-based flours is the focus today, and the different applications. And similar to some of our other live events that we've done, we put kind of a collage of videos for the specific type of flour we're going to discuss. So we'll do a little bit of an overview of the flour. We'll show you some of the videos from our courses that represent that flour, and then a little bit more talking points on that. So the format of this live event will last about 40 minutes within terms of presenting information. Then we'll go to Q&A as usual, answer your questions. So feel free to load any question around the flour concept there. And if you haven't been to a live event before, there is a place to enter these questions on the top right, and we'll get to them near the end of the program. So let's talk about the history of flour and wheat-based flours and the different components of it. Chef Jacquy and Martin, take it away.
Yes, I mean, the history of flour, we won't have time to cover all that, because we would go back thousands of years, but the most important thing, I think, for our students and anybody who wants to bake at home is to be able to really see the differences between each flour, and then how they can use them for certain recipes. For my experience after teaching for 26 years, I know students are always very creative, and they always try to find new ways to do things. But when it comes to flour, and my background is first production. I grew up in a bakery, and I produced a lot of baked goods over the last 46 years. I started when I was 2 years old, and one thing is sure in my mind is that you need to find a flour that is stable. That means it's made by a reputable miller, manufacturer, and then once you have a good cake flour, a good pastry flour, all-purpose bread flour, whatnot, you need to stick with it, because it's all great to try different flours and this and that, but as Chef Martin is going to explain to us, every flour has its different properties, and if you, let's say, instead of using a King Arthur flour, which is very stable, I've been using it for 26 years at the school, and our students were very pleased with the results, because they were always the same. But if you have a local mill and you get a flour made just a week ago from that mill, you're going to say, oh my God, the result is not the same. And so this is where we're going to try to explain a little bit why it's not the same, and why you should stick with the same flour most of the time for your baked goods. Chef Martin, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think that's a great framing, Jacquy. And I should say Chef Jacquy. I'm sorry. I'll try to remember that.
No, you can call me whatever you want. Just call me late for dinner.
Exactly. So, yes, first and foremost, consistency. And both in my home baking and also my professional baking, I want consistency. I want to know that a flour has a range which relates to falling number, which affects the fermentable activity or the activity of fermentation. I also want consistent protein. I want consistent ash, and I want consistent water content. So that's probably maybe even a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. The idea here is that baking has so many variables that we want to make sure that the flour is consistent year over year, season to season. And like Jacquy said, if I'm sourcing from a mill which is more local, they don't have the ability to blend in the way that a larger mill does. They also may not have the technology which allows them to do a little bit finer job of milling, whether it's via a roller mill or other processes. So consistency first and foremost. And I would say that as a professional baker, and Jacquy, you should comment on this as well. I mean, the bulk of what I use is all-purpose flour, is an 11.5, 11.7% protein flour. That's the bulk of what I use. And then I may bring in something with more protein, like a 12.7 or what we might call like a high gluten or bread flour. I may bring in some of that for seeded doughs or things which need a little bit more of a backbone, maybe croissant or, challah or things like that. And then pastry flour for scones, biscuits, some coffee cakes and things like that. But the bulk of what I use is all purpose, and then going out to sort of pick and choose other things as necessary, looking at them not only for flavor, but also just sort of as tools, right?
Yeah, that's a great point, because especially the King Arthur flour, all-purpose flour, has a decent amount of protein. And like you said, if you want to make a recipe, let's say you want to make croissants, and your recipe is made with all-purpose flour, but then you might want to use 2/3 all-purpose and 1/3 of bread flour to make sure the dough keeps its shape and its texture during the lamination process. And on the other hand, if you want something a little more refined, if you want to make pound cake and whatnot, muffins, maybe you'll use half all-purpose, half cake flour. So I like that idea of using all-purpose as your main flour, and then play with it. But again, the absolute key is, if you have a system that you find the ratio of flour that you need for croissants and this and that, you need to stick with it, because I've been talking to students for 26 years, and they're always they're very curious, and they're always interested in changing a system that actually was working. They're like, I found this flour, blah blah blah, and then I use this instead of my all-purpose, and the croissant did not come out. Well, of course that did not come out, because you had a perfectly well-balanced recipe, and then you just changed the main ingredients. So get a system together and then stick with it, and then after that, it's just a matter of doing a good job in lamination, and always use quality ingredients, butter and eggs and milk and dairy product, to make sure that your end product is always the best. People always they think that if you have this really rare flour or not often produced flour from an area that is, some mill who is just doing it 2 weeks in the year, that's gonna give you the best croissant. That's just a very romantic idea created by marketers. And actually, to make good croissants and bread and breakfast pastry, actually it's the opposite. Find a stable ingredient, and then just focus on your techniques. And this is what produces the best finished product.
I agree with this 100%, Chef, because there's an old adage, what do they say? A bad carpenter blames his tools. And I think it's accurate, because you want something which is consistent, but it's almost like using something which is consistent puts the focus back on your own skills. And that's why we're here, right? We're really here because Absolutely. We're talking about skills, right? And Absolutely. So I know that Chef Jacquy is still interested in growing his skills. I'm interested in growing my skills. I mean, that is an endless sort of pursuit. That's why it's called craft. Craft is about this sort of endless pursuit of betterment of our own skills, more delicious things, more beautiful things. And having that consistent flour allows you to operate with and see your own skills as they interact, as opposed to the variability of a flour. And then once you have things figured out, yes, add some flours that you feel like, maybe a non-glutinous flour or something like that. You can mix things up, but first concentrate on your skills, 100%.
Yes. Okay, so we're going to review the few flours that we selected. So we're going to start with cake flour. So cake flour is the flour that has the lowest amount of gluten in the flours available to us, and and it can go. There is no one rule. It could have 7%, 8% protein, but I think the King Arthur flour has even a little bit more, right?
Yes. Yes.
So there's no set rule because every miller does the flour that they want. It's kind of like winemaking, right?
Yes.
And then it's up to the user to perhaps modify the recipe around that flour, because that flour will always be the same. That's the beauty of it. And what a lot of people don't understand is, or they don't realize, is that flour is a product that is alive. It's not. It cannot sit on the shelf like many people do for years, and they hope that it's gonna react the same way, right? I mean, flour contains what, 14% water, would you say, on an average, and it's alive. It was milled. It was put in bags, and then it's sent out to the customers. So people need to be aware of that. It's an ingredient that really needs to be taken care of. And so cake flour has less gluten, more starch, right? And then usually we prefer to use it for things that do not require gluten, the stretchiness of the gluten. So those things could be shortbread cookies, could be muffins, pound cakes, brownies. Those are finished product where we want a very moist crumb, right? And we don't need a muffin that is bouncing back when you throw it against the wall, right? I think we have a video, Chef Scott, to show a few products that are made with cake flour. Okay.
All right, great. So that showed a couple of snippets from videos from our programs showing a lemon pound cake, shortbread cookies, the chocolate brownies, and those beautiful waffles, all using cake flour as the main flour in these desserts. Why would that be? And let's recap that, guys, for the choice.
Yeah, it's as I mentioned before, it's those are products that are looking more for the starchy aspect of the flour and not so much the gluten, which is what makes a product rubbery and hold its shape. Here we want the opposite. We want something that is so light and flaky that it will actually fall apart when you eat it. and you in the video you saw the crumb of the lemon pound cake. If you would make that same lemon pound cake with bread flour, it might look much tougher, much more rubbery. Chef Martin, you want to add something to that?
No, I think, Jackie, that's a great summation. We're looking for tenderness. We're looking for a fine, even crumb. We're looking for a very short, what we would call like a short texture. It's friable. It quickly breaks. There's no bend before it yields. So, the only thing I would add is that we switched away from a traditionally bleached cake flour, and now all of our cake flour is unbleached, just because we felt like it was something that we were standing on in terms of the quality of our all-purpose and our other flours. We didn't have any flours which were bleached, and so we decided to go ahead and extend that to our cake flour. The protein is slightly higher than a sort of traditional cake flour, but we find that it works well in just about any use that you would traditionally use for cake flour.
Fantastic. And now that we covered cake flour, we can go to his older brother, Pastry Flour, which is kind of like an odd. That's the middle child, right, between cake flour and all-purpose. So it's a flour that has has a little bit more gluten, and chef, you know how chefs are. Some chefs, they swear by it, and others are like that. Just use all-purpose. So there's actually no bad answer here. Like you said before, you're a person who uses mainly all-purpose, and then you just add things to it. So what's that saying? All roads lead to Rome, right? Something like that. We have enough flours out there for chefs to figure out what they prefer, because a chef is an artist, it's a craftsman, and any chef can do whatever he wants to do. Going back to cake flour and gluten, I have a recipe of muffin made with bread flour. Okay, and so the reason why we do that, it's actually a sneaky recipe, because we use bread flour, because in that recipe we put so much moisture, and in the form of heavy cream and also butter, so that there's so much butter and heavy cream or sour cream in that recipe that it would not hold together if it was made with cake flour. So we use bread flour, because that bread flour is going to bring the texture that I want for this horrendous amount of butter in a muffin. So again, every chef can do whatever they want to, but again, you have a system, and then you need to stick with it, right? Cannot change systems all the time, because it's just chaos. So pastry flour is kind of in between cake and all-purpose. A chef might just be using this for their pound cakes. Why not? Or muffins or shortbreads, or they're gonna use some pastry flour and some bread flour for croissant. It's all about ratios, and it's all about understanding what each flour does, the starch in the flour, the gluten, and how it reacts. And talking about gluten, because I worked in 5 different continents, and flour is not just flour. You go from one place to another, and then you have a gluten sometimes that is very, very weak in the beginning, and as you mix it with water and you mix it with the friction, it gains in strength, while another one might just be very strong in the beginning, and the more you beat it up during the mixing, the weaker it gets, and others are just weak or strong during the entire process. So you have to, as a baker, you have to really pay attention to the product that you're making, especially when you're mixing bread and you're hoping for a gluten development, and maybe it's happening, maybe it's not happening right away. You with your eyes, you can really see a lot. You cannot just say, "Oh, mix it for 20 minutes and then walk away." No, instead you should stare at it and just see what's happening. That's where the answer actually is. Chef Martin, you want to add to that?
I think those are all great points, Chef. I would just sort of upvote or emphasize maybe two quick things. And one is that, it really comes back to skills, right? The baker's awareness, which grows through time and experience, touching doughs, seeing doughs, listening to doughs in the bowl, watching how they bake. So skills will help you overcome those things when you go to I've done the same thing. You go down to, for example, someplace in the Caribbean, and you're working with flours that don't have the strength or mixing tolerance that we're used to in North America. And that's where your skills really come in. So I would say bring all of your awareness anytime you're working with any sort of dough. Bring all of your awareness and all of your focus, and that will help you as a baker see the differences between, we're out of pastry flour. What are we going to do? No muffins today? No, I'm going to use all purpose. I might need to increase 86 the muffins. No, doesn't work like that. People come in, they want to buy the muffins. So what are you going to do? You're going to use your skills. You might have to increase fat or something like that to make sure that you still have the same amount of tenderness. So these are the skills that we learn through our time as bakers, and hopefully through the use of a consistent flour, which gives us that experience.
Yeah. So let's move into the next types of flours we're talking about. Pastry flour. What is pastry flour? And all-purpose flour. I know those have a little bit higher protein content than cake flour. So when would you use pastry, and what is that? And when would you, like you said, using all-purpose pretty much all the time, and what's the protein on that?
Pastry is kind of like the brother of cake flour. It has a little bit more gluten, and we will in a minute we'll see a few videos of products that we made with pastry flour. That's when you want a little bit more gluten, a little bit more texture, but that doesn't mean the product is going to be rubbery. Sometimes it's for a recipe that, as I mentioned before, has an addition of a lot of butter or dairy product or whatnot, and so you want a little bit more gluten. Chef Martin, you agree with me?
Yeah, 100%. As you go up the scale too, from cake to pastry to all-purpose to higher gluten flours, often you'll also see some increase in ash too, which is the mineral content in flour. So cake flour is very light in color. Pastry has a little bit more of a blonde hue. AP or all-purpose can have a little bit more. And with that increase in ash or the mineral content in flour, you also see more flavor. Whole wheat flour, for example, has lots of mineral content because the bran is where that is concentrated. And so that's the one other thing you might mention, is that as you go up the scale, you also increase the flavor content of the flour itself.
Yeah. All right, Chef Scott, we have a few videos, I think, to show.
Yeah, let's show the one that represents pastry and all-purpose.
Okay.
Great. So we saw in the beginning the chocolate pound cake, cannolis, the cornbread, brioche, apple turnovers, all different videos from our programs that kind of make use of either the all-purpose flour or pastry flour. And speaking of all-purpose flour, what is the reason? Why do we call it all-purpose, Martin?
Yeah, it's a good.
I'll let Martin answer that one. But I wanted to say that in those videos, for instance, the brioche and the puff pastry for the apple turnover, they were made with some all-purpose flour. That's exactly because we want to be able to incorporate butter, a lot of butter in those recipes, and so we need the added gluten all-purpose has versus pastry flour, and that's the main reason. If you don't pay attention to those things and you try to make puff pastry with cake flour just to be creative, well, you're just going to have a pancake. You created a pancake, but you're not creative at all. You need to pay attention to the properties of each flour and then use them well, and always respect the fact that you cannot just use any flour for anything. It doesn't work like this. Others have tried, and there's a reason why certain recipes are made with certain flours. It's not Chef Martin or myself or Chef Scott who decided that. It's over centuries where chefs have tried out recipe and failed miserably, and here we are. We know now which flour works best for what recipe, and then you just stick with it, and then just enjoy the successes, right? So, Chef Martin, all-purpose. Why is it called all-purpose?
Boy, it's a good question. I think in society we often think of jack of all trades, master of none. But I think that so it's a little bit dangerous, right? All-purpose. Does that mean it can be used for everything? Well, I mean, it means that for a broad category of products, from baguettes to brioche to pizza dough to scones, if the ratios of fat and liquid are correct, it can cover a broad category of your uses out even into something like a daily bread, maybe a sourdough, a pan de campagna, or things like that, even into Italian breads like ciabatta. All-purpose can be used because it's a moderate or sort of medium level of protein, depending on the flour that you choose. The flour that I'm most used to is 11.7% protein, which may even be like slightly just a titch high on the normal all-purpose category, but I think it works really well. I've made a lot of baguettes over the years out of an all-purpose. And Jacquy, when you were growing up in baking, would you use that sort of all-purpose for the base of a lot of your stuff, or in your teaching, do you find that an all-purpose flour works well in such a broad category?
Yeah, for the teaching, we use a lot of all-purpose because like you mentioned, it's so broad. The uses are so broad, and it's something that you can find pretty much anywhere in the country, right? If there's one flour that is going to be in a supermarket, it's going to be all-purpose. After that supermarket might have bread, might have pastry, and might have cake. We don't know, but the all-purpose is going to be there. So that's why I like your approach is use the all-purpose and try to make most of the recipes with them. But then, the next topic that we're going to talk about is bread flour. And so you mentioned you made a lot of baguettes with all-purpose, which is fantastic. And but bread flour is typically used to make bread, obviously, but also, some people use it to make croissants. Again, if you make your dough with bread flour, this is then not a dough that you make by hand, because that dough is going to be very tough. But it's a dough that is going to be holding its shape, that's for sure, because it's made with a flour with more protein, and then you need some kind of a dough sheeter, but that dough is not gonna blend well with the butter, which is what we want. We want a great lamination. So some people swear by that. They use only bread flour. Some people use a ratio of whatever, bread flour and all-purpose. And then after that, we have baguettes and ancient grain, miche, and even flatbread. You know, I make my flatbread all with bread flour. And the flatbreads that I make, I bake them in my wood burning oven, and it is so hot that actually I saw your pizza oven. It's also really, really sexy. I love those flames, right? We all are the same. We just take photos of the flames. But when the heat is so high, actually it completely disintegrate the gluten. And if your flatbread dough is very, very rubbery, by the time it's baked, it goes through that really hot oven. There's no rubbery. It's actually really crispy. So bread flour is obviously for bread and works really well. But like Chef Martin said, you know, maybe you want to use all-purpose or maybe a mix of it, right? Every baker can do whatever they want to and follow the recipes they want to, right? But again, we come back to the same thing. Find a flour, find a recipe, and then perfect it. Stick with it and perfect it. Yeah?
Yeah, I agree completely. And, you know, the only thing I would add, Chef, is that as in the past 3 years or so, I've been writing a lot more formulas for home bakers. And I have found myself using more bread flour than I did in the bakery. And the reason is that in the bakery, we have access to spiral mixers or planetary mixers, which do a very good job of developing dough, of sort of leveraging the amount of strength that exists in a flour. And I know that many home bakers don't have access to those tools, which is fine. And so I've found myself using more bread flour because it holds more water, right? More protein content means higher absorption. It means the dough has a greater capacity to sort of hold its form at higher levels of hydration. So when I'm making doughs that are really open structured, like a pan de cristal or some of the high hydration, country loaves, I found myself using a little bit more bread flour because I don't have the ability to develop dough in the same way. So again, skills inform the tools we choose, and the tools that we choose include or are not limited to machines. They also include flour, because flour is used in addition to flavor for the structural integrity of what we make, or the lack thereof if we want something tender. So bread flour, I find myself using a little bit more bread flour now.
Yeah, love it. Chef Scott, we have a few videos on products made with bread
we
flour.
have a montage video for bread flour, and let's take a look at that. Then we can talk about the instances used.
Excellent.
All right, thanks for that. So that's just a few things, from the carrot cake to the beer bread to the rye bread using bread flour. Sorry, that was into the whole wheat. We were looking at the croissants and the baguette, the English muffin to finalize that up with the bread flour. So any comments on that before we move to whole wheat flour?
I think we're pretty good, Chef Martin.
I mean, whoever made all that good-looking stuff should be proud of themselves. Maybe that was you, Chef.
That's Chef Scott. Chef Scott. He did that.
Beautiful work.
Just this morning. Before the event. So it's just amazing. As my protege.
Moving into whole wheat flour.
So yes,
I have a question.
Specialty flour.
What's the protein content typically on a whole wheat flour?
Chef Martin.
Over 14. 13.8 up to over 14. Even sometimes you see those grains coming out of the field over 15. I was at a farm earlier this year, late last year, over 15%. So they can be very high, especially as we go further north in North America, but generally in that range. It's not, just briefly, it's not equivalent to a 14% protein white flour because it's not quite the same, but those protein levels can be quite high.
And this section should really be called specialty flours. I don't know what's a good term for them, but it's all the other flours, whole wheat, rye, spelt, and kamut, and you name it. Those are other flours that can be used for bread recipes, but even for some pastry recipes. We put whole wheat flour in carrot cake. It adds a great taste. I mean, you mentioned that before. The flavor is more intensified in wheat flour, and then also we put some wheat flour, rye flour in a miche, and then we use rye flour in a beer bread, which is just fantastic, and so this would call for a whole live event itself, all the different types of flours and how to use them. But one thing I want to make sure our listeners, our viewers understand is they cannot just take a recipe that has only bread flour, and replace it with 100% wheat flour or rye flour, right? The gluten or the composition of those specialty flours is not the same. So one would have to, let's say if somebody wants to make a baguette with whole wheat flour, what ratio would you recommend, Chef Martin, for instance?
Well, not only do you have, different protein contents, but you have vastly different absorption, right? So
yes,
bran by weight absorbs far more water than starch by weight, which is predominantly what we're talking about when we're talking about white flours. So in order to make a whole wheat baguette, we've really got to increase hydration, 85% maybe. I would say at least 85, 87%, depending on the whole wheat, where the grain is sourced, how it's grown affects hydration requirements. But generally, you're talking about lots of water and gentle shaping. Can be done, but not as beautifully, I think, as a more balanced approach to maybe, you can get some whole grain into a baguette, but just be careful because too much whole grain takes you away from the spirit of what it is, which is thin crust, open structure, crispy, not too much fermentation flavor. These are the things that are hallmarks for baguettes.
Yes, and I like your answer. Just putting whole wheat flour into a baguette is not as simple as just, adding 25%, changing 25% of bread flour with whole wheat flour. There's a whole host of other things that one needs to be careful. And so one experiment at the time is what I recommend for people who want to do that. And then really, again, research, ask questions, and then observe the dough as you mix it. Like you said, you need to hydrate it more, and then the mixing is also going to be different. So it's important to do research before you start mixing dough. And then we talked about rye flour. It's the same thing. You cannot just make a baguette with 50% rye flour, 50% bread flour, because rye flour does not react the same way as bread flour, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, rye, even if rye is measured at the same quantity of protein, it gets complicated quickly, but essentially the quality of protein is different than that we find in wheat. This sort of balance between the subcomponents which come together to form gluten favor extensibility instead of elasticity. We could get very complicated, but take Chef Jacky's word for it. One step at a time, one small change, and honor the category. If you're making baguettes, make sure that they still look like baguettes, that they eat like baguettes, and they're not just baguette-shaped objects. It's important.
Baguette-shaped object, yes, that's a good term. Chef Scott, you have a few videos for us?
Yeah, let's roll into the whole wheat flour where we do have the carrot cake
Okay.
and the rye bread.
Okay.
That was a beautiful work. Tell us a little bit about the starters, the different color of those different stages of starters. One of them using whole wheat.
Yes, we would like to start our starters with a little whole wheat flour or specialty flours, and Chef Martin is the expert in that. You want to tell us why we would do that?
I don't know if I'd say expert, but I will say this is that, you know, using a whole grain flour to start a starter is kind of like giving those microorganisms a multivitamin. There's an incredible amount of mineral content. You're also bringing in the exterior of the grain, and in the field, that's where the bacteria and also fungi are concentrated. That means that you have the building blocks that are required to produce a starter, which grows over time and feeds off the minerals which are in that flour itself. So whole grain flours, niche flours, always a good place to begin to make a healthy starter, and then gradually we switch it over to a diet of white flour once the organisms have received some stability or reached some level of stability in their populations.
Yeah, we mentioned it in our course. Whole wheat flour, for instance, has a lot of wild yeast particles that will help, like you mentioned, help the starter get its boost. It's kind of like a jump starter, and then once the starter is more stable, then we can continue to make the starter with bread flour. So that covers those specialty flours. Now I want to touch on proofing and baking, and we can already right away answer one question that we saw that is going to be asked. Is somebody asked, should I use or trust the proofing drawer? And my answer, and Chef Martin's answer, is no. And the only reason why is no is because I had one in the kitchen, and I don't know if you have one if it was built in the kitchen, and I put a thermometer in there, and it rose all the way to 115 Fahrenheit, which is way too hot. So I don't know who's building those proofing drawers, but they're not bakers, and they did not talk about to bakers. But with that said, if you can keep your proofing drawer around 80 Fahrenheit in those areas, then yes, you could. But I recommend sticking a thermometer in there to make sure, because I have not seen one that works well. Chef Martin?
No, they weren't made for anything with butter in them. That's for sure. Especially not croissant, unless you want to make a low-fat croissant because all the butter's going to run out.
Nice. Yeah.
But no,
Because butter breaks down at 90 Fahrenheit, and then if your proof is above that, the butter is going to melt. It's just not rocket science, right?
Yes, and we can maybe just say one quick plug, and that is that proofing is such a critical stage, and I think in the home environment, it's one of the hardest to control because you need warmth and you need humidity. And also judging level of proof is one of those things or points in the process which takes time to get your experience with. So be thoughtful at that juncture around humidity, warmth. Don't be too hot, don't be too cold. Find that Goldilocks zone, which is different for many different products.
Yeah. So for us in our courses, what we do, we ask our students to put a small saucepan with about 1 inch of boiling water in the saucepan. We put this in the oven that was not turned on, so it's a cold oven. We put this pan in there, and we stick a thermometer in there, and then the seal of the oven door is actually creating a humid environment, and where humidity stays in there and the heat stays in there for a long time. And that's a great way for us. I mean, our students are all using this system and they're very happy with it. But I think King Arthur Baking has a proofing box right on the market, which I saw. Can you
Yes.
elaborate on this?
Yeah, so we've been using one that's made by Brote and Taylor, and it's a small box with a little reservoir for moisture, and then it has basically a base, which is a heat plate, and it has an adjustable temperature. It's very good for doing everything from proofing to making yogurt. It's an adjustable, sort of thermostatically controlled proofing device. I think that works pretty well. The one other trick that I will say is that for proofing doughs, for this sort of stage of bulk fermentation, what I find myself using a lot at home too, if I don't have a Brote and Taylor or a fancy proofing box, is the microwave. I put a jar of water in there, microwave it for 2 minutes, and then my vessel of fermenting dough can go in there, and that can be actually a very stable environment as well. There's no draft, and it's a good way to go until you find yourself with more time or resources to get yourself something slightly more advanced, which I really recommend, especially when you get into viennoiserie, which proofing is so critical for.
It will do the trick. The key when you proof something, and I'm glad you emphasized the fact that it's one of the critical aspects of making yeast bread is once it needs to proof, it really needs to be done well. The heat has to be gentle, humidity has to be there, and then it cannot be too long or too short. But the key is that it's proofing away from drafts, right? You cannot have a draft coming in, a draft of cold air or hot air coming in, and that would just influence this proofing. So the key is to really protect the item that needs to proof, protect it from the outside environment. And then in that box, microwave or oven, we create its own special environment, humid and warm. And if you do that, it works really well. It's like growing plants. I'm not good at growing plants, but I know that people who are good, they tell you the plant needs so much humidity, so much water, and then it will grow, right? And it's kind of like the same thing with bread, So one has to be very, very careful with that. And then after that we have the baking, which is again a topic that could be used for a whole live event, because like you, I'm talking to hundreds of students, and the question of baking always comes up. My oven is doing this, my oven is doing that. And so my recommendation is always the same. Check your oven, put put a thermometer in there and set it to 300 and 350 and see what your oven said, what your thermometer says, because it might be completely off, right? Maybe you move into a new house and that oven has never been calibrated for 30 years and you think everything is going to go well, and you have an oven that has a mind on its own, needs to be recalibrated, or it has a hot spot or a cold spot. And then what students don't like to hear is that you have to work around your oven. Your oven will bake a certain way because that's how it was manufactured, and it's not going to change its baking for me or for you or for Chef Scott or for anybody. It will just bake like this. And then you have to make sure that you know the sweet spot for baking certain items, right? Certain items you got to put the cake or whatever on a lower shelf or on a higher shelf, a little bit more to the left, to the right, I don't know. Or using a Dutch oven system, right? If your oven really has a mind on its own, do something around it. You gotta trick that oven, right? So unless you buy a new oven, but even if you buy a new oven, sometimes you're disappointed. You get a new oven and you're like, I paid all this money and that thing doesn't even bake properly, right?
No guarantees. I've spent 6 figures on an oven before and been unhappy. So it's a relationship. It's like any relationship. You have to get to know one another. You have to account for the weaknesses and celebrate the strengths. We all know how that goes. Ovens are no different. Take time, build a relationship, learn its strengths and weaknesses. I do like covered bakers. I have a gas oven at home, and I like to use a covered baker, whether it's a Dutch oven or a Challenger bread pan or similar. If you have an electric oven, they hold steam a little bit better, and so I can do a little bit more baking in there. I don't really do baguettes at home because it's gas oven, but I make beautiful big, sourdough boules and things. So I learn the strengths, celebrate those things, and work around the weaknesses.
Absolutely, and as you mentioned, an electric oven, a gas oven, conventional convection oven, those are all going to do something different. Just accept it and then work around it. That's the only way to fly. The only way to bake is to
Exactly.
you cannot find a magic bullet for everything. You just have to adapt. It's like a relationship, right? You have to make concessions and then work with the oven. And once you get past that stage that can be very frustrating, then you see the light at the end of the tunnel, and then you manage to do beautiful baked goods.
The queue for questions.
Okay. Cool.
And let's show that last video that we have
Yes.
that represents cooking.
Yeah.
Excellent. So let's move into our Q&A. Did you want to add anything on that video that we just saw with regards to proofing?
Temperature and humidity are just crucial. You need both. You need the right temperature. In our courses, we are around 77 and 80 degrees, I think. And humidity has to be there. It comes with a pan of hot water or a glass of hot water, like Chef Martin said. Those two things need to be there. If you don't have the humidity, the product will dry out. And but it's not really complicated. It just needs to be monitored with a thermometer, at least for the heat part. And then you should not have any problems proofing items.
Great. So let's go into the Q&A with the team on the call. So the first is a note from Colette. I love my Broad and Taylor proofer for bulk fermentation and proofing. It's limited for proofing shaped product as it only fits a quarter sheet pan. Do they have a second you can buy that doubles the capacity? Is it super reliable in general?
That's a great question. It doesn't hold even a full half sheet tray, which is a bummer because if you're making croissant, the smallest amount that I'm going to make is a half sheet tray, right? So not having that full size means that, I'm looking for other options. But in terms of proofing loaves, bread in a banneton or similar, it's great.
Great.
Yeah. But I said, you can MacGyver your own. Just get a big bin, a big plastic bin with an airtight lid and put a pan of hot water and a thermometer in there and off you go,
Great. Next question is also from Colette. It's is there a blend of King Arthur flour that can be approximate 00 flour from Italy, or one we can make from the King Arthur flour in our pantries?
We actually sell a 00 now, a 00. We have a 00 both in wholesale and at retail, and it's nice. It's slightly softer than all-purpose, so it's about 11% versus like 11.7%. If you have all-purpose and you want to approximate something, just increase your water a little bit. Again, back to bakers and tools, right? Increasing hydration lowers slightly the ability of gluten to sort of form in that situation. It's going to give you a little bit more elasticity. Or extensibility. It's going to give you a little bit more extensibility. But check out the 00 flour. I've been really happy with it.
Great.
So next question is King Arthur flour available in Canada?
It's not, unfortunately. It might be able to come in through Amazon. I'm not positive about that, but reach out to customer service. We've got a baker's hotline. Even if you have baking questions, we're always there answering the phone, and it's a real baker. It's not just someone who's passing your phone to someone someplace else. It's an actual employee.
Yeah, but Chef Scott, Patrick, our videographer or production manager, is based in Vancouver, so we could just ship him some boxes of flour, and he can be his own distributor, right?
Exactly.
Right. All right, thanks. Next question is from Sheila. If a flour is bleached, does it act differently than unbleached flour? I've always wondered about this myself.
Yes,
in
bleaching
terms of
ages.
The functionality.
Yeah, it ages flour. Oxidation ages flour in the same way that you can, age a dough, and essentially by beating it pretty hard in a mixer, it oxidizes. So yes, bleached flour can present as stronger. But a well-made flour, well-milled flour with good numbers and good strength, you can develop the strength very well. So I'm not sure that bleaching is worth the sort of trade-off.
And why do companies, why do millers bleach flour?
I think it allows them to use a lower quality grain, for one, and two.
Yes.
I think it comes down to color too. There was a time when the aesthetic of a whiter dough was more valuable. Yeah,
and it also extends the shelf life. Once you bleach it, you semi-kill it, and so it's not going to spoil so quickly, and obviously it yields more profits. So, but one should use unbleached flour as much as possible.
Because it's flavor, we're talking about flavor too, because as flour is bleached, you're removing carotenoid pigments, you're removing flavor elements, and we want those. Life's too short to eat bread that doesn't taste good if you have access to it. So use the yellow, use a flour which has a yellow hue to it. That's, beta carotene. These are agricultural elements. Flour is not like salt or sugar that just sort of sits on the shelf, like Chef Jacquy was saying. It's living, it's in motion.
Absolutely. And flour doesn't have to be white, right? Like you said, if it has a hue, kind of like a yellowish hue, a brownish hue, it's normal. And like you said, life is too short for us to eat bleach, right? I don't know.
All right. Next is a note from Robert. The best way to get your sourdough starter, and what do you recommend as a beginner of this process in regards to amounts of best flours for the best outcome? Thank you, Chef. So interesting. For my experience, I created my own starter back in March 2020, along with the rest of people decided to make sourdough. And then I've shared it with enough people that I actually have a sourdough starter family tree going on. But tell us something, Martin, about the best way to get your own sourdough starter.
Well, usually what I tell people to do is follow a recipe, just like anything else. Don't just start slinging stuff into a bucket and stirring it. I recommend that you start with a recipe. Ruby has a great recipe, I'm sure. French Pastry School has great methods that they teach. King Arthur has pages and pages of content dedicated to how to start your starters. So I would say start with a blueprint. Trust someone who's tried it before. But essentially, you're going to feed a mixture of equal parts by weight flour and water, usually, like we've said, a whole grain flour of some type. And then over the course of about 7 days, you do a series of refreshments where you remove a portion, cleaning the cage, sort of, to speak, and then adding flour and water back in to give a fresh feeding. And over time, the organisms which are in there, the bacteria and the fungi, come into symbiosis, and they sort of work out their differences. They kick out some of the bad guys, and you end up something that has been leavening bread for thousands and thousands of years for good reason. It tastes great. It makes breads which have better shelf life and are more healthy.
Some people struggle with starters or other fermentations. I've been playing around a lot with making sauerkraut, making kombucha and starters. At the end of the day, it seems complicated, but it's really something you need to pay attention to. It's like any living organism. It needs to be kept at a certain temperature with a certain amount of humidity or water. And then like the bread starter, if it needs to be fed, it's like a puppy. You need to feed it, right? Otherwise, it's going to die, right? And if you don't pay attention to temperatures, feeding time, and the fact that you have to refresh it, add more flour, if you don't pay attention to those things, your starter will not start and will die. So it is complicated, but at the end, it's not complicated. You just have to pay attention to the details and follow the recipe, and then you'll have your starter for the rest of your life. There's no reason because as it gets older, if you continue to pay attention, it will gain in strength and character, and then it will have less and less chances to die.
Excellent. All right, we did put a link for a sourdough starter from King Arthur here in the question links. So next question is from Alexandra. I'm interested in the online program. Is there currently a 20% off offer? Yes. So until June 7th, it is 20% off for all of our programs.
Just for her.
Right. Next one is, good afternoon, chefs. Any tips on making the perfect pizza dough? Thank you. And this is from Claude. Perfect pizza dough.
Chef Martin, I see you make some pretty stunning pizzas,
I try to.
I know you're half Italian, so.
Yeah. So the key with pizza, I think, and it's true with many fermented products, is that there's a secret ingredient, and the secret ingredient that's never on a label, it doesn't have calories, is time. Time is the ingredient that we really need to honor, right? And so don't expect to make a great pizza dough in an hour or two. If you want to make a really good pizza dough, mix the dough when you're not hungry, and then let it sit. So fermentation, both at room temperature and then extended, I think some cold fermentation can be really nice with a low percentage of yeast. So, and then also flour choice is important, but, an all-purpose flour will make very good pizza. 00 flour makes very, very good pizza. We have some great recipes on our website for a Neapolitan one. But in general, for those of you who know baker's math, look for a dough which is, if you're going to use all-purpose flour, maybe 65 to 70% hydration with a low quantity of yeast, and 2% salt. Give it a couple hours of bulk fermentation, and then divide it, round it, put it into containers at maybe 250 grams each for a 10-inch pizza, and put it into the fridge cupboard for up to 48 to 72 hours. You'll have a pizza dough that'll be very flavorful, and it honors the origin of pizza, which in my mind is really topped bread. Pizza is really just garnished bread. So make a really good base dough and you'll have great pizza.
Yeah, I mean, most of those flat breads that are out there that, even the tarte flambée and then the pizza, all those are actually originally leftover bread dough that eventually bakers decided to roll out and throw something on it and then put it in the oven because the oven was still hot. And that's how it was born. But yeah, you can ask any real pizza maker. He usually has the dough sitting in the fridge for 48 hours. So like you say, Martin, if somebody has a pizza party on a Saturday night, they really should start making the dough on Wednesday when you're not hungry, and then let it sit in the fridge for a couple of days, already pre-portioned. And then on Saturday, it's just a matter of rolling it out and then putting it into a nice and hot oven. Wood burning would be recommended, but if you don't have that, you just put in a hot oven. And that's really, I agree with you. That's more the secret of making a good pizza than using an ingredient that is really special.
From Aldo, one of our students who's in our programs. Greetings, chef. Unfortunately, where I live, I cannot find King Arthur flour. What characteristics should I look for in a flour in addition to the percentage of protein that is appropriate for breads that support high hydration?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are places that I've baked where it's very hard to get flour that can hold water, and actually has good fermentation tolerance. I've worked in places where a dough which mixes up well, degrades during fermentation, and it ends up just sort of shredding. And I would say in those places where you don't have access to flour which is graded by protein, or flour which ferments well, or flour which is unbleached, what I find myself doing in those places is just gravitating towards things that I can make. And it may be that I'm making, small flatbreads, or maybe I'm making biscuits and scones or more tender products. But ultimately, I don't try to put a square peg into a round hole. I look for the strengths of what I have, and then I make those beautiful things and still, allow myself to participate in the act of baking, which is joyful regardless of pizza or scone or cookie or whatever.
Yep.
Great. Thanks, Martin. So next question is from Caitlin. How do you recommend storing flour? It's a great question.
Well, very good question.
I worked in many continents, and the answer is, how quickly are you going to use this flour? And do you live in a hot and tropical climate, or just in a, let's say in a climate that is just normal, if you want to call it like that? You can store flour in a dry, and usually dark place, cool place, dry and cool place. If you use it soon, if not, keep it in the refrigerator, right? If you live in a tropical climate, keep it in the refrigerator. I mean, I worked in Hong Kong, and the first thing that we were doing when we were receiving flour from the purveyor, we would freeze it first, and then we would sift it because there were all kinds of bugs, also called protein, right? Added protein that were there because the flour was not always that was stored just in a warm warehouse. So, you want to add something on storing flour?
Yes. So, absolutely 100% what Chef Jacquy said. The only thing I would add to that is that if you're using flours which have whole grain, which are whole grain, which means that the entire berry is ground and then goes into the bag. In that situation, the germ, the genetic material of the grain itself, which has a high fat content, is in there and it will spoil. So I say, make sure that any of your whole grain flours are stored cold if you aren't going to get to them within a matter of, months or less. For us, generally here, I have some whole wheat out at room temperature, but anything that I'm going to hold on to for a little while, I always hold in the freezer and double wrap. So I put the paper bag into a plastic bag and then make sure it's airtight. So cold for whole grain.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, chefs. Here's a question from Roseanne. How do you calculate the amount of leavening for a recipe? Is there a formula? Thank you. And I would assume this would be leavening for bread with yeast.
Yeah, probably yeast with bread. Well, that's a question for Chef Martin. It's a loaded question.
It's a very loaded question. There are a lot of ways to answer that, but ultimately, here's my thought, and that is that it comes down to, we need to divide it out a little bit. If we're talking about commercial yeast, meaning, we're opening a package and we're adding yeast, that's sort of one leavening approach. And then on the other side of the fence, we have what we call like natural leaveners or sourdough cultures, things like that, levain. So what I would say is that ultimately what we're looking for with a quantity of leavening are a few things. One is, processing time, how long is bulk fermentation, and what's our anticipated final proof. The other thing that's really, I think, the biggest consideration is flavor. How much fermentation flavor in the case of natural leavens or sourdough cultures do we want to pass through to the final product? There's some considerations around strength as well, because fermentation does add strength to our leaven products. But so those are the considerations for me: flavor, function, and processing time. There's some doughs that, because of production requirements, need to move more quickly because they have to hit a window where the oven is open, right? And you got to get them going. Other things you may be able to sort of sit on and let them take their time to develop in the case of some of our naturally leavened breads. But Chef Jacquy, correct me. What's your opinion there?
Well, I remember my father, who was a baker. He knew only how to make bread that would rise slowly. So he would make the bread dough at 5 p.m. And I remember he would use 200 pounds of flour and water and salt. And then I would see him put a very small amount of yeast. Even as a young person who did not know yet what baking is about, I was telling him, that's very little, and so, but it's exactly what you're saying. The longer you let the dough rise, the less amount of yeast you need to put. So he would then get up at midnight. By the time he gets his act together, it's like 12:30 or so. So the dough had actually 7 to almost 8 hours time of rising at room temperature, just covered with a plastic top. And sure enough, by 1 a.m., the dough would be ready to be portioned and shaped and this and that. And because he used 8 hours of fermentation, he did not need to put a lot of yeast. And like you say, the flavor was great because it had 8 hours to develop. If you make a recipe that is, you mix it and then you let it rest for 20 minutes and then you shape it, and then you want to bake it that same day, kind of like a toast bread thing. That's more like a bland bread that you're going to make that doesn't have a lot of character, but maybe that's what you want from a toast bread. You just want something to make toast, and the toast bread is actually not the hero here. And so the shorter the rising time, the more yeast you would put, and the longer the rising time, the smaller amount of yeast. So there's no real answer. There's not one formula. Say, okay, this is the percentage of yeast you put. You just have to follow each recipe that is given to you, and then after that, like you said, you have to respect the proofing time. And if the recipe says let it proof or rise for 12 hours, 24 hours, that's what you do, you know?
Chef, one brief thing that I would add is that if you're in a place where you're trying to sort of learn quantities that people are using to initiate fermentation, just start going in and using baker's math to figure out, oh, okay, this recipe has 15% pre-fermented flour, and this is the quantity of seed in the leaven, or here's a baguette that has the yeast percentage of dry yeast is 0.5%. Like, start doing your math, and you'll begin to learn, and gravitate towards quantities that you prefer in bread.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds like we could go on for a long time with all of these questions. They're so detailed, offering their own program. So moving forward with Julietta, what is your advice to even out the size of bubbles in the bread? And she says, I use water yeast, a pandemic hobby.
Chef Martin, that's for you.
Yeah. So, I think the question relates to, it sounds like if she wants to even out the bubbles, that she might want a more consistent crumb, a more sort of homogeneous crumb, right? So, as a baker, when I want a more homogeneous crumb, and if, assuming we're not talking about a situation where there is any enrichment, I would look towards reducing the water just a little bit and working on my shaping, making sure I'm shaping nice and tightly, and having a dough which is sort of medium soft and not super soft. With a softer dough and higher water content, you can have a crumb which is a little bit more sauvage, right? A little bit more of a savage crumb. Yeah. So I look at nice firm shaping, slow down the activity a little bit, and a nice firm dough, and you'll get a nice homogeneous, piece of bread, which you can put some toppings on, and it won't end up on your shoe,
Okay.
All right. Looks like we have about another 10 questions. So we're going to kind of go into a lightning round here and give us some quick answers to their questions here. So okay. I have the OO pizza flour. When this is being used, is the dough have it has a wet, tacky consistency? Thanks, chef. It sounds as though that the hydration is pretty high.
Yes, depends on the formulation, and as always, if you're the baker, you're the boss, right? So you can adjust according to the things you like. But I would say that generally speaking, a 00 flour is slightly softer than AP, so it may feel a little bit soft, but that also allows better expansion in the oven because it's not so much strength that the dough is sort of constricted. I hope I answered that right. I love the lightning round idea, though. That's fun.
All right. We're going to tag team also, chef to chef. All right. Hello, chefs. This is from Marcy. Even as a celiac, I'm sure I will glean something here. Okay. So to date, as of today, the best gluten binder she's found was psyllium husk. Any thoughts, discoveries, or insights on a natural gluten-free bread baking?
I mean, that's what I'm using. I've done a lot of gluten-free baking. I find it incredibly interesting. It's incredibly challenging to make a bread which performs to my expectations without gluten. Gluten is the structural material that we're trying to build our bread skyscrapers with. But psyllium, I think, is your best bet. There is nothing better than psyllium that I have found, and I've been making a lot of gluten-free bread. So keep going at it. It's not an easy hill to climb, and when you need a break and go back to something easy, make things that don't have to be tall. Make flat things. Make beautiful crackers, gluten-free crackers, and things like that.
Perfect
there
crackers.
Are incredible opportunities for flavorful grains. But just challenge yourself in small bits with the sort of gluten-free artisan stuff, because it's hard. And I say that like having done it a little bit.
And that's not a lightning answer, So I wanted to add to that. I've been working on a gluten-free pizza crust for many months, and what I do also, I use a potato starch that I mix with cold water, and I put it on the stove and stirring nonstop. And once it comes together, then you just have to cook it for about 30 seconds, and it becomes kind of like a rubbery glue. And so I use a mix of potato starch and cereal husk for that, for those kinds of bread, especially for pizza.
Thank you for the lightning answer. All right. Next question from Nicole. We're trying to find the right ratio of King Arthur bread flour to proof times when making malasadas, which are the fried sweet dough, to get them to be stretchy and chewy. So we are also considering augmenting with the gluten. So it sounds like I've had malasadas when they're nice and chewy and you could kind of pull them apart. But the ratio of the flour to the proof time is the question, I'm pretty sure.
This is a very challenging question because so many factors from, proofing conditions, production, what are the tools you're using? What's the level of development in the dough? Boy, that's one of those things I'd want to be in the shop with you and just go side by side. But I would say it sounds like you're you're thinking along the right lines. Just keep working,
Yep.
Yep.
All right. Next question is from Daniel. Is there a King Arthur whole wheat flour for nearly 100% of the flour in my sourdough? Most are too heavy to rise. So we talked about this earlier, not really using 100% whole wheat flour because of the high protein content. Is there anything within King Arthur's product line that you might recommend?
I mean, if you're looking for a whole wheat flour with slightly less protein, try that white whole wheat, which is very good. It's a stone ground white whole wheat. If it's too heavy, you should increase your hydration. Don't apply the hydration levels that you're using with a white flour leaven to a whole wheat flour leaven. Increase your hydration levels because a whole wheat dough will be stiff at 80%, whereas a white dough you may want 65% or something like that, if that makes sense. The absorption of whole wheat is so much higher, you need to make a requisite increase in the quantity of hydration.
Yeah, that makes sense. So this next question is from Amelia. I have a question about developing a gluten window. Sometimes even with a mixture for over 20 minutes, I'm unable to develop the window. Do I keep kneading or maybe suggesting going to a higher protein content flour?
This can be a question of flour that does not have enough gluten. I mean, we talked to a few students from areas around the world that just don't have the right flour, and so you can mix that dough until the end of time, and it might not come together. But also, I always tell my students, when you start a yeast dough, the first 2 minutes are absolutely crucial. You got to make sure you hydrate the dough enough so it comes together and it can start doing its thing. If it's too dry or too wet right away from the get-go, you're going to have some difficult times moving ahead. Chef Phillip, you want to add something like a 30-second addition?
I'll be quick. I promise. It's hard. The method of development will also determine whether or not you're going to see a window pane. If you're kneading by hand, it's almost impossible to get a window pane unless you're really doing a slap and fold or something like that. So if you're having trouble with the pane, try this. Incorporate, mix to combine. If we're talking by hand, right? Mix to combine, put it on the counter and let it rest for half an hour. Come back and give folds and check your window pane. So time is another way to develop strength, not just mechanical action.
So Chef Scott, I see a question about base temperature. I can answer that separately because it would need us to calculate and all this.
It's not a lightning efficient answer. Okay, great. So we're going to move on to Julietta with regards to while I have the gene that all celiacs have, after a few years of gluten-free, I went back to eating some flour because my top priority is to avoid plastic. Any recommendation on making one's own gluten-free for bread? I think, Julieta, we kind of answered that with the potato starch and psyllium husk method that Chef Jacquy noted. Next question is from Jillian. Hello, chefs. Could you please briefly touch on the high ratio flour? When is it appropriate to use? Pros and cons? Thank you, from Jillian.
Chef Phillip, 30 seconds.
Yeah. High ratio flour, I think what the question refers to is for use with cakes, right? So making high ratio cakes. In that case, I think cake flour is best for high ratio cakes, right? But I would say the proof comes out of the oven, right? The proof comes out of the oven. If you're using a cake flour and you're not getting the results, then keep looking around until you find the result you want.
Yeah, and you could also trick the recipe and use pastry flour or all-purpose flour and substitute like 10 to 15% of that flour with cornstarch, and then you might get a different result, a better result than just using cake flour.
Yep.
Good answer. All right, so next question is around, hi, chef. In baking cake or bread, we normally use cake flour, pastry flour, or all-purpose flour. Now, most people are moving towards the healthy thing. And what do you think about using whole wheat flour in breads or cake? Wanted to know the pros or cons. Thank you. So once again, a larger question, but the concept of making it healthier by incorporating whole wheat flour into cake, for example.
Yeah, I mean, we answered that a little bit before. Just like in our carrot cake, you put some whole wheat flour. You cannot, whether it's for bread or for cake, you cannot completely change the whole flour for whole wheat. Maybe adding 25% of whole wheat is a good start, right? And then see where the recipe takes you. Chef Martin, you want to add on to that?
I agree 100%. Start with 10, 20, 25% as a percentage of the total flour, and then proceed from there, keeping an eye on hydration, adding a little bit of a hydration at a time to sort of accommodate or account for that extra bran content.
Yeah.
And some things are very much improved by those adjustments. So pursue it, and I wish you luck.
Great. Next question from Demetra. Thanks. Hi, Martin. What is the highest percentage of whole wheat flour you suggest when making a whole wheat sourdough loaf or miche? And what other flour would you use in the formula, and what percentage? Thank you for being here today. So the highest percentage of whole wheat flour you would use.
I mean, I've written recipes for 100% whole wheat high hydration loaf, so if I'm doing that, I may need as much water as 110% water to flour. So it can be very high. Wow. Those breads tend to be like too heavily bodied for me, even if they're open crumbed. They just I don't like enjoy eating them that well. So for me, this is really a matter of preference. I think some great loaves can be made with 50% whole wheat, or even 60%, 66% whole rye if you're making a pain de seigle. So I like breads like that. Ultimately, though, it comes to your taste. Pursue your taste. You're the boss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Excellent. Chef Jacquy, anything you want to add?
No.
Or is that a pretty good answer?
Very good answer.
All right. Aldo, stepping in again. Is it true that European flours have more moisture than American ones? And he'd love King Arthur to be exported to the Dominican Republic, if you can do anything about that, Martin.
Can you make
That's
this
a challenging
happen,
one. Yeah, I would love to. I've been to the Dominican Republic twice, down there baking in rural communities and trying to work with the local flour. And so I feel your pain. It's hard. European flours are graded on a different moisture system than the flours in the US. So I'm not sure that they're actually sold at a different moisture level. It's just that they're rated differently. And I'm sure Chef Jacquy could expand upon that.
Yeah.
Given
you're absolutely right. It's a different way of calculating it, but at the end, it's very close to the flour we have here, because otherwise, if there's too much water, way too much water, it will eventually spoil. So, with that said, Chef Martin, you're going to have to see how you can ship flour to the Dominican Republic. That's on you. Maybe you go on a vacation with 2 large luggage and then make it happen, you know?
I've definitely taken flour down there before, but Aldo, I wish
You need
you,
a 10.
I wish you lots
You need
of
a
luck.
10.
Yeah, I need a 10.
Thanks, Aldo. All right, a couple more questions here. This is from Regina. Hello, what flour do you recommend for making an almond croissant?
Loaded
We spoke
question.
a little bit about this.
Yeah, the
It
same
could
as you
be
used to make a
all-purpose.
great croissant.
Almond croissant. It could be all-purpose. It could be two-thirds all-purpose, 1/3 of bread flour. Chef Martin, you want to add on to that? It could be all bread flour.
Could be all bread flour. It really depends on the formulation. You know, it depends on formulation. It depends on fermentation. It depends on whether or not you're using any natural leavens in there. What I always tell people is start with a recipe that works. First, make a great plain croissant. And once you have your great plain croissant, then you know that you've got your lamination process down. Use that same dough to make your almond croissant.
Yeah, and baby steps, especially if you make this recipe at home, then you have to start with the all-purpose flour only, and then see how this dough reacts. And then if you can sneak in some bread flour if you want, go for it. But if you make things by hand, you need to start with all-purpose flour for sure.
Otherwise, your forearm's going to get really big because it's hard to roll that bread flour out.
Like mine.
You look at this guy. Eat your spinach.
All right, thanks, guys. What about flour enhancers for stability from Kishar?
Not a loaded
Flour
question.
enhancers, do you use those, Mark?
Yeah, I'll take it. I think that flour enhancers are really only appropriate in an area where, in some big production scenarios, we want to look at, additives of some type, and we want to try and use some clean label additives, but things like ascorbic or other treatments can be beneficial. But I would say, first and foremost, try and find yourself a flour which is of high consistent quality and a strength which is appropriate to the products you want to make. And if you're still having problems, then I would say, yes, go ahead and look to improvers and things like that. But I think that you can get almost all the way to your destination in most cases just with a good base ingredient.
Yeah, but for somebody at home, they could put a little bit of vitamin C, right? That should help the flour and the gluten to get stronger. But like you said, Chef Martin, try to first work with a flour that works, and then if not, then add things like ascorbic acid, vitamin C, and whatnot. But only if you have to.
Yeah, and fermentation can be a great tool there too. Don't forget, fermentation can be a great way to strengthen doughs.
Okay.
Nice. All right, a couple more questions in this lightning round. Any resources to suggest for flour in Canada, seeing that King Arthur is not in Canada?
I think that there's some great national flours, and there's certainly a lot of wheat that is very good quality grown in Canada. That's no doubt. That's why there's a lot of, half the flour in Italy comes from Canada, right? Manitoba. It's very good. They grow very good flour up there. I'm not as aware of the national brands, so I can't really recommend anyone. But if you're looking for interesting mills, there's a very, very good mill outside of Quebec called Moulin des Cèdres, like Mill of the Cedars. Very, very good mill outside of Montreal. But I'm sure that Canada has great quality national flours. I just don't know them off the top of my head. If I lived in Canada, I'd give you a long list.
We had this question before, Chef Scott, and I don't remember the brand that we recommended. We can maybe take this, answer this by email. I just have to look for my notes. But I remember I contacted my colleagues in Canada, and they all mentioned one brand, but I don't remember it on the top of my head. There's nothing in the top of my head.
All right, I see that. We'll make a note to follow up. Thanks, Chef. And the last question here is from Sheila. What would you do with some amount of pounds of bread flour that's been sitting in the pantry for a year? Use it or trash it?
Trash it. Martin?
Yeah. I mean, check the best by
year,
date.
1 year.
1 year. Yeah. I mean, if it's been in there a year, you're pushing it. But I don't know. Here's what I would say. Check the best by date first and foremost. I don't want to get myself in trouble. And then try it in something. Try it in some pancakes or something and smell it.
Yep.
But if it's a white flour, it might still be okay. On the King Arthur website, we did a blog about that. Go in there and look around, and I bet you'll find the blog, or send a note to CS and to customer service and ask them. But generally speaking, remember that flour is a perishable food, and respect it. Use it as best you can. If you can't eat it all, make it and give something away. The world needs more goodwill at this point, and nothing like a baked good to celebrate that quality.
Yeah, and Eli, you're right. Maybe make pancakes or something easy like this. But also, one has to be very careful. If you have flour sitting for 1 year in your pantry, not only you will have bugs in your flour, very small, tiny bugs. And if they are in your flour, they are in every dry food that you have in your pantry, including rice, cereals, rice cakes, and rice. And what I'm saying is from experience, living in tropical countries, and that's how it works. The bugs, they don't just stay in the flour. They're like, we're just happy here. We don't need to go to the other places. No, they go everywhere. So you're gonna have to dump everything and then clean it and then buy fresh. Yeah, you can sift that bread flour that have been sitting in the pantry for 1 year, and then see if you find something in the sifter. If you find bugs or little eggs, then that's your answer right there. Toss it.
Okay. Well, Chef Jacquy and Martin, thank you so much for your time today. We almost went 2 hours, and I think we probably just touched the tip of the iceberg of the amount of knowledge that you hold.
Yeah.
So thank
you
for sharing your time, Martin. It was great to meet you and have you come into our Ruby Live event. And thank you again, Chef Jacquy, for everything you do. And until next time.
All right. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.